The official story of what happened in this valley is simple. It has been simple for 127 years. 1891. Four of the most respected engineers in the country sign a report. A record storm. An old earth dam that gave way. 2,209 people dead in the town underneath it. No one was to blame. Case closed. Except the record those four men left behind does not say quite what everybody remembers it saying. There is a survey that contradicts the height of the dam, a letter that contradicts the claim that nobody was warned, and a decision, taken 9 years earlier, that raises more questions than either. None of this proves a conspiracy. It proves something more useful. The story we were given is not the story in the record. And the record starts on a Friday morning in a steel town in the mountains of Pennsylvania, where it has been raining for days. On Washington Street, a woman is putting her children's boots by the stove to dry because they will need them again in an hour. The bakeries are open. The Cambria Iron Works has already called the first shift, and 4,000 men are inside it, turning pig iron into steel. Down by the river, a boy is watching the water come up over the curb the way it does most springs, and finding it more interesting than school. Nobody in this valley is frightened. Johnstown floods. Everybody knows Johnstown floods. They have a joke about it, and they have been telling it for years, that one day the lake will come down off the mountain and take the lot of them. It is the 31st of May, 1889. By 4:10 this afternoon, the woman, the boy, and 2,207 other people in this valley will be dead. The lake will have come down off the mountain. And the joke will turn out to have been the only warning anybody got. Here is the part that has never sat right. That lake was not weather. Somebody put it up there. Somebody owned it. And everything that happened to it in the 9 years before that Friday was a decision that a person made and signed. So the question is not how a dam fails. Dams fail. The question is what the men sent to investigate this one found when they got there, and why, for 127 years, nobody went back to check it. Start with the water, because the water was always there. Lake Conmore sat in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, 450 feet above the streets of Johnstown and 14 miles upstream. It was not a natural lake. The state had built it in the 1840s to feed a canal, and when the railroads killed the canals, the state sold it off. By then, the dam had already failed once. That was in 1862, and the lake had drained away to a stream running through a valley of stumps. It sat like that for years, a ruined dam, a dry basin, and below it, a town that made steel. Nobody died in 1862. That is the detail worth holding on to, because it is the reason nobody was frightened of what came next. In 1879, the property was bought by a group of men from Pittsburgh who wanted somewhere to fish. They incorporated as the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The membership list is the part that matters, and it is not a secret document, and it has never been sealed or lost or hidden in any archive. It is simply a list that most people telling this story have never read aloud. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, Philander Knox, who would become Attorney General of the United States. Around 50 men, and among them, very likely, the greatest concentration of industrial wealth in any private club in America. They built cottages along the shore. They kept boats. They ran a clubhouse with a dining room, and members came up from the city by rail for the season. And here is what does not fit. By the standards of what these men could afford, it was a modest place. Nobody was extravagant here. Nobody was reckless in any way they would have recognized. They wanted a lake. To have a lake, they needed the dam to hold. And to make the dam hold, they hired nobody who had ever built one. The original dam had been engineered, not elegantly, but seriously, layers of puddled clay pressed into the upstream face to make it watertight, a wall of dressed stone, and a profile calculated by men who expected water to try to get past them. When the club rebuilt it, the clay was not replaced. Mining waste went in instead. And the crest, the top of the wall, the thing that decides how high the water can rise before it spills over, was cut down. The 1891 report says it was lowered to widen the carriage road along the top so that two carriages could pass. Later engineers think the real reason was simpler. The crest was the nearest pile of dirt, and they needed dirt to fill the old breach. We do not know which it was. Nobody wrote it down. What is not in dispute is how much came off, and I am going to leave that number where it is for now, because we are going to come back to it twice before the end of this, once in 1891 and once in 2016. It will not be the same number both times. At the base of the original dam, inside a stone culvert, ran 5 cast-iron discharge pipes. They were the dam's only means of letting water out deliberately, of lowering the lake before a storm, rather than praying it stopped raining. They were removed and sold for scrap, and the culvert behind them was plugged with hemlock planks. Who took them is genuinely contested, and the two best sources do not agree. David McCullough says a congressman stripped them before the sale, but the 1891 engineers say the club did it. The repair work began in April of 1880, months before the deed changed hands, which muddies it further. So set that argument aside, because it is not the important part, and it has swallowed a great deal of attention that should have gone somewhere else entirely. This is the important part. For the 9 years the club owned that lake, no member of it ever put the pipes back. There was no way to let the water down. There was only the spillway, and the spillway had a problem of its own. The club had stocked the lake with 1,000 black bass. They were hauled in by rail at considerable expense. Fish, being fish, tried to leave. The way out was the spillway, an open channel cut into the rock at one end of the dam, and the single route by which a rising lake could get rid of itself without going over the top of the wall. So the club built a bridge across the mouth of it. From the bridge, they hung screens, rigid screens below, floating screens above, standing at least 5 feet up from the channel bed. At first, nobody thought anything of it. It was a fish problem, solved with a fish solution, and for 8 seasons it worked exactly as intended. But an engineer who examined those screens afterwards estimated they had cut the space available for water by 40 to 50%. Half the emergency exit closed, so that 1,000 base could not swim home. None of this was hidden. The dam was visible from the road. Men from Johnstown rode up to look at it. The town's own newspaper ran the anxiety as a running joke, and the joke was always the same shape, that the lake was up there, that one day it would come down, and that there was nothing anyone could do about it. But one man did not treat it as a joke. In 1881, the works manager of the Cambria Iron Company, Daniel Morell, sent his own engineer up to inspect the dam. The engineer came back and said it was unsafe. Morell wrote to the club offering to pay toward fixing it properly. The club declined and assured him the dam was sound. And then there is the part that is easy to read past. Morel was himself a member. He had joined, some say, precisely so he could keep an eye on it. Remember Morel. He is the only person in this story who looked at that dam, understood what he was looking at, and had the money to do something about it. He died in 1885, 4 years before the flood. And when he went, the last man watching that dam went with him. The rain that arrived on the last night of May 1889 was, by the standards of that watershed, the largest anyone had recorded. It fell through the night, and it did not stop in the morning. In Johnstown, the rivers came up into the streets before breakfast, which was not unusual. That is the detail that kills. Johnstown flooded most springs. People moved their furniture to the second floor, as they always did, and waited for it to go down, as it always did. Nobody in the town looked up. 14 miles above them, the lake was rising at about 10 inches an hour. The club's manager had men digging at the far end of the embankment, trying to cut a second channel to take the pressure off. Others were up to their arms in the spillway, trying to clear the screens, which had done exactly what screens do in a flood and packed solid with debris, so that the half of the emergency exit, still open in the morning, was closed by lunchtime. Somebody was sent to the telegraph office at South Fork. Twice, the messages went out. Johnstown had heard that warning before, most springs of its life, and had learned what it meant, which was nothing. So the men on the dam dug, and the town moved its furniture upstairs, and both of them were working from the same understanding of that lake. Both of them were wrong, and not in the way anybody has ever been told. But the arithmetic that shows why would not exist for another 127 years. Water began to cut across the top of the dam near the middle, which is the way an earth dam dies, not by cracking, but by being carved from above, a notch that widens as it deepens. Between 10 and 5 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, the notch reached down far enough that the rest of the wall stopped being a wall. 20 million tons of water started to move, and it did not empty in 45 minutes. That is the figure the story usually gives, and it is wrong. It took over an hour, which is worse. An hour of continuous discharge, a river turned on and left running. What came down the valley was not a wave of water. Within a mile, it had taken the valley floor with it. Soil, trees, houses, boulders the size of rooms, 40 miles of track torn up and carried along. A wire works with its entire stock of barbed wire, and the locomotives standing at Conemaugh, which had picked up and moved. Witnesses describe a dark hill moving down the valley, 30 to 40 feet high. Almost all of them mention the sound before they mention the sight. There was no alarm system. There was no time to build one. But at East Conemaugh, a railroad engineer named John Hess did the only thing available to him. He put his locomotive in reverse. He opened the throttle, and he ran backwards down the line toward the town with his whistle tied down in one continuous blast. That should not have worked. In that valley, every engineer had his own whistle signal, and they were distinct enough that wives knew from the kitchen which man was coming home. One unbroken note meant danger, and everyone in the valley understood it without being told. It was the only warning Johnstown ever got. Hess survived. So did most of the people who heard him and ran uphill. The wave reached Johnstown a little after 4 o'clock and hit the town from a direction the rivers never came from. It took about 10 minutes to pass. What it carried piled up against the stone railway bridge below the town, and the bridge held, which was the worst thing it could have done. because behind it accumulated 30 acres of debris, packed with the contents of a town and with several hundred people alive inside it. Then the debris caught fire from stoves or from oil spilled out of the wrecked tank cars and burned for 3 days. Some of the people trapped in it were pulled out. Some were not. 2,209 people died. 99 entire families were wiped out, including 396 children. 98 children lost both parents. A third of the dead were never identified. They were buried under blank stones in a plot on the hillside, where the markers say nothing because there was nothing to say. Bodies were recovered downstream for months. One was found in Cincinnati, 600 miles away, 22 years later. Clara Barton arrived 5 days after the flood with the American Red Cross. It was the organization's first major disaster relief operation, and she stayed 5 months. Money came in from every state and from 18 foreign countries. The town was rebuilt. It flooded again in 1936 and again in 1977. And not one of those later floods killed anybody in numbers like this, because no one had built a lake above them. Which left a question the survivors were entitled to ask: who pays? Johnstown sued. Of course it sued. And it lost. Every time. The doctrine of the day required a plaintiff to prove negligence, and a Pennsylvania court held that the flood was an act of God, that the rain, not the dam, had done it. But the club itself was a corporation with almost nothing in it. The wealth sat with the members, and the members were not the club, and so there was no one on the other side of the case with anything to lose. Not $1 of damages was ever paid to a victim of the Johnstown Flood by the men who owned the lake above it. Several of them gave generously to the relief fund. Carnegie built the town a library. It stands there still, and it is now the Flood Museum. And the court did not decide that on its own. It had a finding to lean on, and that finding was still being written. Which brings us back to 4 engineers and a report. The American Society of Civil Engineers convened a committee to establish the cause. Its members were among the most respected hydraulic engineers in the country, and the society itself was young. This was the profession establishing what it was for. They went up to the dam. They surveyed what was left of it. They ran the calculations available to them, and in 1891, they published. Page 456 is where it happens, and I want to read it to you as it was written, because the whole thing turns on a single word. The Hunting and Fishing Club, in repairing the breach of 1862, took out the 5 sluices in the dam, lowered the embankment about 2 feet, and subsequently partially obstructed the wasteway by gratings to prevent the escape of fish. These changes materially diminished the security of the dam. There is the number we left behind. About 2 feet. Hold on to it a little longer. And notice what that paragraph is. It is the case for the prosecution, written by the investigators, itemized in the club's own building materials. Then, in the same sentence, comes the word, but in our opinion they cannot be deemed to be the cause of the late disaster, as we find that the embankment would have been overflowed and the breach formed if the changes had not been made. One conjunction. Everything before it describes negligence. Everything after it removes the consequence. The arithmetic behind that word is on the same page. The dam, as originally built, would pass 6,923 cubic feet of water a second. As the state finished it in 1853, 7,980, and the flood coming in, they estimated, was not less than 10,000. 10,000 is more than 7,980, so the dam was doomed either way. That is the entire exoneration. It is one subtraction, and it stood for 127 years. But there is something in that report the committee did not know it was leaving out. The original dam had two spillways, a main channel and a second auxiliary spillway cut into the southwest abutment, a whole additional route for a flood to escape by. By 1889, it was gone, filled in, invisible, and the committee never counted it. In 2016, 3 researchers published a peer-reviewed reanalysis of the dam break. Neil Coleman and Aldous Cactons at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown and Stephanie Woino. For 127 years, nobody had rechecked that sum, until someone finally sat down and did it. They had something the 1891 committee did not: modern dam breach hydrology and no particular reason to want an answer. They rebuilt the dam on paper as it was originally designed. Then they asked what it would have done with the same storm. And here is where the number we have been carrying since the beginning comes back. The 1891 committee said the crest had been lowered about 2 feet. Coleman's survey put it closer to 3. That is a foot of wall that the men who exonerated the club did not know was missing. It had an auxiliary spillway, open. It had 5 pipes at its base. Its discharge capacity at overtopping was more than twice that of the dam the club left standing. Their conclusion, in their words: a properly rebuilt dam would not have overtopped and would likely have survived the runoff event, thereby saving thousands of lives. The original design could have held for as much as 14 additional hours. And there is one more finding, and it is the one that is hardest to sit with. The water flowing into the lake had already peaked, hours before the dam gave way. The dam did not fail at the height of the flood. It failed after the worst was over. Now go back to the committee's own subtraction. 7,980 cubic feet a second of capacity against 10,000 coming in, a shortfall of about 2,000. The auxiliary spillway they never counted would have carried roughly 900 cubic feet a second on its own. The 5 sluices they knew about, but treated as already gone, another 700. Put back only what the original dam actually had, and the gap the committee called inevitable starts to close. Of that certainty, the 2016 paper says only this: the confidence they expressed that dam failure was inevitable was inconsistent with the information available to the committee. Available to the committee. Not discovered since. Available to them, at the time, on the desk. There is no villain in this story who wanted anyone dead. That is not the shape of it, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. What the record shows is smaller and more familiar than villainy. A wall was lowered, probably because lowering it was convenient. Pipes were sold because they were worth something as scrap. Screens went up because 1,000 base were an expense worth protecting. Each decision was reasonable on its own, made by someone who would not be standing downstream, and the cost of every one of them was carried 14 miles away by people who never had a say in any of it. Then, an investigation concluded that the sum of those decisions had changed nothing, and the law agreed, and the men who made them went on being the richest men in America. And we still do not know the things that would settle it. We do not know whether the crest was cut for a carriage road or for convenience. We do not know for certain who sold the pipes. There is no minute book. What we know is that it took 127 years for anyone to run the numbers again, and that when they did, the dam, everyone agreed, was doomed turned out to have been survivable all along. That is the part that should bother you. Not that the answer was wrong, that nobody checked. There are a great many questions in the record that were closed early by people who were respected. In documents nobody has reopened since. That is what this channel does. We go back to the paper and we tell you who was actually holding the pen. Subscribe to Obscura Archives and we will keep going back for the answers.